you've had in this series. I feel very privileged. And of course, I must thank Dr. Pratibha Jain for, suggesting this in the first place. So my talk is about music information retrieval. And of course, information retrieval per se is a topic, I guess, familiar to those working in the data sciences. And I'm going to talk about, more specifically, take examples of from some of the work we've done in Indian classical music. So this talk, as you can imagine, has contributions from my students in recent years, some of whom have been very excellent musicians themselves. Okay, so to get started, maybe a slightly formal definition to the term. Music information retrieval is about processing, analyzing, searching, organizing, and accessing music-related data. So, of course, one of the most obvious forms of music-related data would be the audio signal. That is what reaches our ears and, evokes, all the, powerful sensations that we know about music. So this is a kind of data. It is a little abstract, but in the course of this talk, we'll actually, get a little bit closer to understanding the physical characteristics and what's really important from the information retrieval perspective. There's another resource, a form of data known as the symbolic score. So this is a written notation of music. So it's typically used, for example, for transmission of music, let's say from a composer to a performer. So the performer reads the score and renders the music. Now, this is, of course, a very, very valuable resource in terms of music data in Western classical genres, not so much in India. And one of the reasons, of course, is that there's not such a big distinction between the composer and the performer in the Indian art music scenario. And then, of course, we also have, text resources in the form of musicology or musicology works, that is books written about the music, discussion forums, blogs, etc. And there are, of course, the prospect of using NLP techniques to, mine this in order for us to find interesting information about music. Okay, so let's look at the audio waveform. So like I mentioned, the first two, the audio signal itself and the score, the musical score. These are very directly related to the music. And the audio waveform, of course, is, like I said, the most direct of them all. Now, if you look at a waveform, it's not terribly informative, right? So all these fluctuations actually look like some random variations. But we do know that music is a highly structured acoustic signal, right? It's not, what might be suggested by this waveform, but on the other hand, it actually contains information in a very organized and structured manner. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the score, representation of music. So the Western music notation actually, represents music by a sequence of notes. Each note has properties such as its pitch height, what is its fundamental frequency, its pitch, what we perceive as the pitch of the sound, which is given on these vertical lines, and also the duration of a note. Okay, so the type of symbol used and, roughly the distance between the symbols would talk about the timing. So pitch and timing are completely captured here. If you look at a Western music score, it will, it's something like this. So it's mainly about showing the notes. For example, the top line happens to be a sung line. So there are some lyrics over here. The bottom line refers, is meant for a polyphonic instrument because there are multiple notes being played together. There is some expression also, kind of explicitly indicated. And of course, there is a lot more that the performer brings, while rendering the piece. Now, of course, to a listener, this very detailed, what we might call a transcription of the music into notes is not so interesting. To a listener, or even, for example, for the, MIR applications, we might be interested in more of the, higher level perspective, like, okay, what's going on? How is it developing as we go along time? What are the sections that are being repeated? Are they identical? Are they slightly different from each other? So these are the kind of, investigations that, MIR techniques might be put to in the case of music, which has, represented by notation. Okay, so what are the popular MIR applications? Recommendation is something that's really well known and something that common people use. So recommendations about recommending, let's say, artists, songs, and so on to listeners and fans. We'll have a little bit more to say about it as we go along. Music learning, providing feedback by analyzing the audio itself. It can be an important application. And of course, aids such as accompaniment, you want a timing accompaniment or an instrumental accompaniment, to go with the music. And perhaps, using the properties that you would derive from the audio, you could actually generate accompaniment. Guided listening with rich annotation, which is something that I just referred to when we talked about the symbolic notation, where a listener really wants to get a perspective at multiple time scales, about the underlying music. Then, of course, it's widely used in music production. I mean, we are familiar with plugins and all, which involve, some audio processing, tools that are available to people to apply to, music that they might be putting together. Computer-assisted composition, that is suggestions to composers, and ultimately, of course, it's only an aid to the creative process. And computer-assisted instrumentation, about, let's say, generating, let's say, an orchestral background to something, a simple melody that, one might have composed. Okay, music recommendations. So of course, recommendation is a whole field by itself. And this is only to highlight that music is different from other items in recommendation because there are many different listening contexts. You have, let's say, party music and, relaxation time music and so on. Also, repeat listening is common. So you consume the same item again and again. And recommender systems can generate playlists for a user based, of course, on the well-known collaborative filtering. It could be from NLP, from blogs about the songs, available metadata. So, a song is tagged by its, genre and various other kinds of, high-level aspects. So these tags could be used in recommendation. And also, of course, audio signal processing, which is really the subject of this talk. We can use that to find very important parameters or attributes of the music, such as the tempo, the loudness, the key, the type of instrumentation. And this could feed into a recommendation engine in terms of finding, let's say, similar pieces, right? So if somebody likes certain pieces, if somebody likes a certain piece, then you could use the audio content analysis to find another piece with matching attributes. So this is basically called content-based retrieval. Okay, so what do we have to take into account in an MIR system? The characteristics of the music, of course, the acoustic signal properties, which are important for perception and cognition. So all this is about, helping a listener and helping a musician. The notion of music similarity or categorization, right? It's very important because, like we just discussed, retrieval is about finding similar or, similar categories. So it's very important to search the concept of similarity. And of course, the appreciation of end applications that are relevant to users. So music similarity is multidimensional, by which is meant that, different users in different contexts may pay attention to different attributes. Okay, so there are many different ways of defining music similarity, and we really need to understand those and take them into account in the design of the system. Okay, so just to give you a quick examples of what I mean by multidimensional similarity. Let's say that we have an example and we wish to query a database with this object, okay, that you see on the screen. If the retrieved item looks like this, you might say, yes, indeed, that's quite a relevant, return because this item shares the property of shape, right? So there is a certain similarity there. There is a big similarity there in shape. And therefore, it is an appropriate item in terms of retrieval. On the other hand, if you got this, the blue rectangle here, you would say, oh, that's an exact match of the color, right? So very, very relevant item. So basically, this is to say that similarity is actually an inherently ambiguous task, okay? So the two items he retrieved are most unlike each other. On the other hand, they have a strong similarity to the example, each in their own way. Okay, so what does it mean for music? Okay, so I'm just going to do a little, a playing out exercise here. And yeah, and of course, what's the talk about music if I don't play some music? So what I'm going to do here is to play out, an example, an item, and then another item, its pair, where the other item is what was retrieved from, let's say, a music database. Okay. So obviously, there is some similarity between the two. And I just want you to listen for that similarity so that you understand the very diverse forms of, music similarity and how, two items might be similar to each other. Okay. पहला नशा पहला खुमार नया प्यार है नया इंतजार पहला नशा पहला खुमार नया प्यार है नया इंतजार. Now, if you were asked, you would say, wow, that was the same song, right? It was the same music. But clearly the audio signals were quite different. So the first one is, a very kind of a diminished version of the second one. Something that might have been, transmitted over the telephone because it's got much lower bandwidth. It's lacking some of the bass and treble components of the second one, which is like probably an original soundtrack. So let's listen to this second pair. Okay, and the second in the pair. Okay, so clearly this was the same song too, but this is quite a bit, different in terms of the tempo, some of the instrumentation. The lyrics were the same, the melody was the same, and this is something that's a great example of what is called a cover version, essentially a re-performed version of the original song. Okay, so just, if you think about it, the comments we made about the type of similarity are all relating to some high-level attributes of music. Okay, here's another one, another pair rather. Okay, so that's a famous song called Rasputin from the 80s by a German band called Bonnie M. And listen to this. Okay, so hope you could detect the similarity there. They were completely different in multiple ways, but I hope you noticed that they had the same tune. Right, so we had a different language. So this happens to be from a Tamil movie that came out a few years after the Rasputin song. So there are, of course, a whole lot of differences in terms of the style of singing, the language, the instrumentation, just about everything. But yet there was a striking, match in terms of the tune of the song. Okay, and so we could go on like this. If we relax, so what I'm showing on this axis is we are getting, a little more and more flexible in terms of musical similarity. So there are, very major attributes that are actually different and some which match. So we could go to same raga, same scale, would be just about using the notes rather than the melodic line itself to indicate similarity. Same genre, even more wide in terms of, encompassing all music from, let's say, a particular culture. And then, of course, same emotion where music across cultures could match each other in terms of emotion. So the point is, what is common across the pair, right? We've already seen audio waveforms, which are not very informative. And as a matter of fact, a lot of audio waveforms look more or less like this. So we might ask ourselves a question as to, okay, here in this data, what is really the aspect that is common, or what is it that we must look to in order to find the match? So it's not the waveform. Is it the frequency spectrum? Not really. When you talk about it at that level, it's again a very low level description of the signal. The temporal variation somewhat, but really not quite, because these are all very low level descriptions of the data. So what we really need to look at are the high level musical dimensions, okay? That is including the melody, harmony, the key, tempo, rhythm, the timbre, which refers to the texture or the instrumentation, the loudness dynamics, the lyrics, the mood. So these are some of the attributes, that we would use to describe the music. And this is indeed the case, this is indeed the set of dimensions that we should use in order to find the match. Okay, so then that brings us to what an MIR system would look like. So we would essentially have our audio in the form of an acoustic signal, derive a signal representation, which actually makes more explicit all these musical attributes that we talked about, and therefore enables us to do a comparison, a much more meaningful, musically meaningful comparison in that space, right? The space of those important musical dimensions with a reference representation, okay, to return a similarity score. So the questions before us are, how do we design this representation? Okay, what do we do on what kind of computation do we do on the audio signal to come up with this representation? And then of course, what do we mean by comparison, right? If we want to develop a system, we want to write software, we need to have equations in place to implement, and we would need equations that tell us the so-called distance between the signal and the reference. And so we need to understand how those algorithms are to be designed. Okay, so our objective in this talk will be to understand what music similarity means, particularly in the context of Indian classical music, with its framework of melody and rhythm. So coming to the outline of the rest of my talk, I'm just going to give you a very quick primer on sound and music, and then we'll talk about these signal representations for MIR, and finally give you some kind of an overview of MIR applications that we can carry out on raga performances. Okay, so sound, as we all know, is you need a transducer to convert, acoustic sound pressure variations to electrical form. And then, of course, we convert that to data by sampling and quantization. A very simple sound is a sinusoid. Okay, so this is a variation like you see over here. And let me just play this for you. This happens to be a sound sinusoid at 200 hertz. Okay, so you would, not argue that this is a very, a pure, simple sound and not very interesting by itself. Let's go to something where we put in some more sinusoids. So this happens to be a sound with multiple frequency components. So what I've shown on the left-hand side is the waveform. What I've shown on the right-hand side is what we call the spectrum of the sound. And these vertical lines tell you that this sound has 4 distinct frequency components. That is basically 4 sinusoids added together give us this sound. And their amplitudes are in this manner shown here. So for example, the 300 hertz component happens to be the strongest here. Okay, so I play this sound. Okay, so that had a certain character. It was a bit diffuse. It did not have a clear, did not suggest a very clear pitch. On the other hand, if you look at something which is more organized in frequency in terms of having a set of frequency components which are multiples of a fundamental frequency. Okay, so we have frequency components here at 200 hertz, 400 hertz, 600 hertz, 800 hertz, and so on. Then what we get, because of this harmonically related set of components, we get a perfectly periodic sound. And if you listen to this, so that was more like a musical instrument sound, right? So, and this also has an important property. It has a clear pitch. The pitch of this sound is again 200 hertz, but on the other hand, its timbre or texture are actually influenced by the fact that we have so many higher harmonics. And of course, their precise amplitude relations also influence the quality of the sound. So F0 is a term used to describe, or it's the physical property of the sound that relates to the pitch we perceive. Okay, so what is really interesting is about the human voice, extremely complex sound in terms of its richness. And also, obviously, we know because of its information content, the amount of information we can convey using our voice. So, very quickly, the source of voice is the vibrating vocal folds, deep in our throat, generating puffs of air. And the vibration is really related to the pitch of your voice. This very basic sound, which is just, pulsating puffs of air, is actually converted to something more sophisticated by passing through your oral cavity and mouth. And we, of course, change the shape of the mouth as we speak. And so we generate a lot of different sounds. The spectrum of the sound, of course, has those harmonically related components because of the periodic, source action. But it also has a certain shape in terms of the relative amplitudes, and these relative amplitudes that we, influence the timbre of the sound, and therefore, let's say, change the vowel that we speak, come because of the shaping of the oral cavity. Okay, so we see here the spectrum of the sound really has information about the pitch, but it also has a lot of other information. And in this case, it tells us what the quality or type of sound is. Okay, so we've been talking about some sensations such as pitch and timbre, and loudness is another sensation. Sounds can be loud and soft, high or low in loudness, high or low in pitch. They have certain physical correlates. So the loudness is most closely related to the intensity of the sound, the pitch to the fundamental frequency like we spoke. The timbre is more of a catch-all term. It relates to a number of spectrotemporal properties. It's difficult to describe the timbre. It has a very rich vocabulary, things like dark, bright, soft, hard, or you might say like something, like I heard a sound like a dog barking, for example. So that would be a description of timbre, more, using in a kind of a categorical description. Okay, but what's music? Now, music is beyond these simple sounds. It's actually, it can be viewed as a temporal sequence of more basic sounds, right? So a music would be an evolving pattern of notes, just as speech would be a sequence of more basic sounds like k, b, t, and so on. Okay, now the really important thing about music is its material is drawn from only discrete pitches. Okay, so when we speak, and in fact, the human voice, it can realize a continuum of pitches, of course, within your own pitch range, whatever that might be. For example, female voices have pitch range between, let's say, 150 to 300 hertz. So we can realize in principle any pitch. But if you are going to be singing or of course even playing an instrument, we typically draw from a musical scale. So we use only discrete pitches. And these are shown here on the keyboard that you see over here, okay? And there is certain terminology, frequencies or pitches are organized logarithmically on the keyboard, so much so that if you go to a note and a note that is 12 intervals away, taking the black keys and the white keys, you end up on a note that is double the frequency of the first note. Okay, and so this particular interval is called an octave. Consecutive notes in this 12 semitone, these are 12 intervals to an octave. Consecutive intervals are separated by a semitone. Okay, and a semitone, as I told you, is logarithmic. It corresponds to a frequency ratio. So everything is in ratios of the 12th root of 2. Okay, and the really fascinating thing is how all musical cultures have come up with very similar intervals that they term musical intervals. And here we show the Indian scale, which corresponds, for example, to the octave going from one sa to the other sa. If you actually write down the intervals, then these are the ratios here, and these ratios correspond, to these the ratios that are shown, corresponding to the keys shown on the keyboard over here. Okay, so now some of this very, underlying this very fascinating, aspect that music across cultures, which probably never even interacted, came up with the same music intervals that are considered suitable for producing music. We owe this explanation to Helmholtz, a very prominent German scientist who actually hypothesized that this is because of the frequency analyzing ability of the human ear, the cochlea. And he recognized that actually this consonance, or what is a pleasant sounding interval and what is dissonant, that is a not so pleasant sounding interval, actually has a physiological basis. And the physiological basis is to do with the interaction of the components that make up the different nodes and how they interact in the cochlea or on the basilar membrane. Okay, so let's get to the music itself, which we said is a sequence of tones characterized by a pitch and a duration. So I'll just play this for you, and you can follow along in this, which actually shows us how the pitch goes up and down and up and so on. And it also shows us the duration of the notes. Like we said, music is also isochronous, that is, uses intervals that are related to each other in terms of multiples. We more or less always have music on a beat. And that's what you see here by the vertical lines. Okay, so this was again a rather simple start. It was a single flute playing a melody. So each of these are notes. We heard the flute timbre. We could tell it was a flute. And we could see that the notes had different pitches and durations. Okay, so we are ready to talk about these high-level attributes. The melody and harmony are, come from the pitch content. The rhythm is the timing information, about where the notes occur in time. The timbre relates to the instrumentation. Okay, so we have now a kind of a connection between these high-level musical attributes and the low-level properties. So we can use, analysis of various types to obtain these high-level attributes, and then hopefully come up with a similarity measure to compare them. Okay, so we are ready to talk now about audio representations for machine learning. So what are those representations that we can compute on that audio waveform? And then link to those high-level attributes, and therefore come up with intelligent similarity measures. Okay, so a Fourier analysis is what we use to obtain the frequency components of sound. So for example, in this waveform, we have actually three components, except they don't occur together. They come one after the other. And if we were to compute the Fourier transform or do a spectrum analysis of this sound, we would get what we see over here as the spectrum of the sound. Which shows us that yes, indeed, there are three components. Okay, but it's not terribly useful to us because it does not tell us this very key information that we need in music about which component came when, right? So this happens to music where three different sounds occurred in sequence, and that information is lost in this form of the spectrum. So what we do use typically something called the short time Fourier transform, which essentially breaks up the signal into much more narrow intervals, and each of these is to be analyzed separately. So we have a figure here which shows that we actually take little clips of the signal out and proceed in time and do a separate Fourier decomposition for each of them. Which for the signal that we are looking at would show us the first sinusoid for a while, then the second sinusoid, and then the third sinusoid. So now we have one more dimension of time in which we must represent music. And that gives rise to what we have shown here as a time frequency representation. Okay, so I have time on the x-axis, frequency on the y-axis. And this intensity tells me whether or not there are components present at that frequency at a particular time. Okay, so what we would now see for our, the signal with the three sinusoids is, essentially the frequency is at this value, and then we change to another possibly note at a higher value, and then a third one. So this two-dimensional representation really captures what we would like to capture musically, that is the time sequence of musical events. This is also called the spectrogram, and this is essentially the representation, that we would use to derive those high-level music attributes. Okay, so for the flute signal, if you look at the time frequency representation, you would see all the notes that we heard. You would see the lowest frequency component corresponding to the fundamental frequency or the pitch. And because it's a real musical sound, it also has a number of other components that are harmonically related to it. So here I have shown the pitch in the yellow line. So if you listen to this, you can follow along. We already heard this. So I won't play this again, but this was essentially the flute melody showing that it had the same pitch, and then the pitch went down and up, and there were some long notes and short notes. So we can see that it's much more obvious in this representation than we could have hoped to ever see in the waveform. Okay, so spectrosam is pretty powerful representation. Here is a few notes on guitar. You can look at the spectrogram and see how the sound changes and, relate it with what you're hearing. Oh, sorry about that. And here is a human singing voice. And what you can note here is how much the pitch fluctuates in time, and therefore we see all these harmonics moving, almost, gradually from point to point. And also you can hear that because of the lyrics, we also see big shifts in the energy across the spectrum, depending on what is being sung at that time. प्यार बरसाए, हमको तरसाए. Okay, and you see a lot of fluctuation, that tells us that there was vibrato in the voice. You can hear the pitch, going up and down very rapidly. Okay, so this is a very powerful representation, and in fact, this is used in machine learning, as a kind of a 2D representation, a kind of an image, as an input representation, and also, to compute loss functions where, whatever you're trying to do, the matching happens between spectrograms. Okay, we also have a more auditory, motivated representation called the MEL spectrogram. That is something that you might come across if you look at audio representations for speech and music. This happens to be very similar to the spectrogram, except that we have a different way of computing it, which gives us, a more resolved frequencies at the lower regions at the cost of higher regions. So that's because our human ear itself is better at resolving details at lower frequencies and higher frequencies. And therefore, this is considered a very suitable representation for audio MIR as well. Okay, so coming to Indian classical music performance, we have a number of instruments playing in a typical concert. We have, of course, the main artist and the percussion, the tabla player. There's a constant drone in the background. We also have a melodic accompaniment, such as the harmonium. The concert itself can be a fairly long drawn affair. It has several sections that the artist progresses through, and of course all of this occurs within the framework. So the artist chooses a raga and a tala, and sings different pieces in each of the chosen raga and tala. Okay, so what are the spectrograms of those instruments look like? Because that's going to give us an idea of what we are up against in terms of trying to analyze this music. The vocalist would be singing, and so they would have this kind of a spectrogram showing us all the harmonics. And of course, we have these very continuous pitch fluctuations. The drone is quite static, not exactly, but more or less. It has all these horizontal components, static frequency components, depending on its tuning. The tabla itself, depending on what stroke is being played, you have a completely different signature. The K is a very low pitched stroke with low frequency components, and the Na and Tun also have, harmonics, but they tend to be more bright sounding. The harmonium, once again, depending on the keys that are being pressed, would give rise to these notes, which are characterized by, flat frequency components, all harmonically related to each other. Okay, so now we look at the music itself, very complicated. This happens to be, I'll just play this for you. Okay, so that was a piece sung or an excerpt from Bhimsen Joshi performance. And what we see over here is we can tell some of the horizontal lines of the harmonium. They're quite distinct. We can see some of the vertical lines because when a tabla is struck, it's an impulsive strike and it gives rise to a vertical line in the spectrum. We can see a lot of clouds here which actually correspond to the voice. And if we analyze this using what is called pitch detection, that is specially tuned for detecting the harmonics of the voice, then this is what we'll find, that this is where the singing portions come in. The rest of it is only where the instrumentation is. And as a matter of fact, if you listen to this now, you can follow along and see more or less related to the melodic contour that has been shown over here, which we call the F0 contour. Okay, so I'll just play this for you. Okay, so what is in yellow here is the vocal pitch. Okay, so all those raga characteristics that we might be looking for and all that are really going to be found here. We can also see some similar, regions here where the singer is actually, revisiting the main refrain, the mukda of the song. And we can see how we could really do this kind of matching by looking at the shape of the melodic contour. Okay, so coming to actual MIR tasks that we might want to do on raga concerts, recordings, audio recordings that we have. Let's just talk a little bit about how we describe ragas, because we need to really relate this to some of those attributes that we may be able to extract from the signal. The musical characteristics of the raga are described by the choice of notes, the order, and the hierarchy. What are the important notes and what are the not so important notes. The intonation, so that is the precise realization or articulation of the note, and the ornamentation of specific notes. There's another really important characteristic of ragas, and that is they are marked by certain characteristic phrases, also called pakkad, and these tend to recur throughout the performance. Okay, so these are all the cues that are embedded in the music, which essentially signal the raga. And as we know, there are hundreds of ragas. There are also some extra musical characteristics associated with raga, such as the affect, the mood, the time of the day, and so on. Okay, so what does music theory tell us? So for the 12 notes written in Indian notation here within an octave, for example, let's look at an example of a raga. Bhupali happens to have only used 5 of these notes. We see the ascending and descending. So this tells us the order in which the notes occur. This also tells us something about the tonal hierarchy, which are the most important notes possibly in terms of their frequency of use, and also maybe the duration that is spent on these notes. So all of this is referred to as the distributional representation of the raga. It tells us something about the distribution of the tones. There's also another aspect to the representation called the structural representation that relates to the actual phrases used in the raga. Okay, so what is shown here are the common phrases. So we would expect these to recur, these particular combination of notes to recur in the raga. And also this tells us something about the intonation. It tells us it is natural. So it's occurring in the location of the basic scale. Okay, so now maybe our MIR problem would get solved much more easily if we were to, take this pitch contour. So here I've shown a pitch contour, just laid it on the grid of the notes and label these, right? So once we label this, we would find those pitch sequences, and then we could match and see whether those pitch sequences belong to that raga, whether all the notes come from a particular raga or not. But this note labeling task is a very difficult one. As you can see, there are no clear boundaries between notes, right? We see notes, what look like notes. We also see a lot of gliding around. We see a lot of, fluctuation. So it turns out that if you ask a musician to label this, they can, of course, because of their training, listen and label this. And this is what they would come up with. And then we would find out that the musician actually uses their knowledge of the raga to come up with the labeling. Okay, so they know, for example, they recognize this shape as a whole, as a particular phrase of the raga. This happens to be a particular raga, Alaya Bilawal, and they recognize that this particular shape corresponds to rather, important phrase in the raga, and similarly the rest of it. So you can see that, trying to first label the notes and then, performing search operations is not terribly practical. So how do we do this? We do this in a different manner by computing a distribution from the waveform directly by actually, doing what I showed you, finding the melodic contour by calculating the important pitches at every time instant. And every time instant, it typically means like every few milliseconds in the signal. Finding a continuous contour, that is a pitch versus time contour like this, that is shown over here. And before that, I must mention that in Indian music, there's another really important stage that we need to know that is called tonic normalization. Because whereas the key names in Western music are associated with, very specific absolute frequencies, the sa, re, ga of Indian music are really movable pitches, and they all refer to a certain chosen bass pitch that the listener, that the performer decides. And then, of course, all the subsequent music, uses distances from that bass pitch to define the different intervals, such as re, ga, and so on. So we need an operation called tonic finding and normalization with the tonic, because to compare, pitches across different songs, we would need to bring them all to the same tonic. And then we could also try some segmentation into steady regions with a very coarse definition, of a steady region, and then come up with these, semi labeled form. Okay, so if we take this distribution or take the pitches and make a histogram out of it, right? So what we are showing over here, the bin index refers to the scale. 1 octave is shown over here. 1 octave is being divided into 1200 bins. The 1200th part is called a cent, C-E-N-T. So we can look at the occurrence of the different pitches. So for example, we find the bin at 700 is the highest, which typically refers to the pa note. And then, we see, for example, that there are only, 4 prominent notes being used in this particular, excerpt that we've analyzed. We could also take the notes and then show a more discrete representation where we might want to then label them in terms of the actual notes of the scale. Okay, so what use this might be? So if we talk about raga classification, we can start by looking at what might be a more challenging problem, and that is to look at ragas which actually have the same notes, right? How do we discriminate these? So for example, if you had ragas which had completely different notes, it might be a slightly easier problem, because we would find out from the distribution that we saw that, how many notes differed and how many notes matched, and decide whether it was the same raga. But in this case, we have 2 ragas, Deshkar and Bhupali, that happen to have the identical scales, the pentatonic scale. But we can see that while they have common phrases and a common scale, there are also some differences. For example, in the exact intonation of the notes, right? And this intonation of notes, there is another component to it, that is the realization of the phrases themselves, these sequences. Now, these ragas, in fact, are considered very confusing. And in fact, students are taught these ragas together so that they might, imbibe the differences, by learning them together. Okay, so if we were to discriminate these 2 ragas, we could draw a pitch histogram, computed on a Bhupali concert, and we would find, yes, indeed, we see 5 peaks corresponding to 5 notes. If we want the discrete representation, this is what we would get. If we did the same thing for a Deshkar raga, then we would see actually a very similar looking distribution, but looking more closely, we would notice, for example, that the heights of the notes in the distribution are quite different. For example, re is very weak in Deshkar, and this is something that all, Hindustani musicians know. And therefore, in comparing these distributions, we must use a similarity measure that's sensitive to these differences. Okay, so then that tells us that if we want to find a representation for the distribution, then we can come up with this computation. But many questions arise. in the sense, do we use a continuous distribution? Do we use a discrete distribution? And if it's a distribution, then what is the width of the bins in the distribution? So all of these decisions is something we have to make in order to come up with a representation that we can use, for example, to identify the raga, right? And then, of course, we have the similarity metric. What kind of similarity measure do we use? There are a lot of well-known similarity metrics for similarity between vectors, correlation, Euclidean distance, city block distance, and something more oriented to probability distributions known as the Bhattacharya distance. Now, it turns out music theory is not very helpful in these decisions because music theory is not very precise. So it's not that you can read the theory and decide that, what bin width you want to use or what measure you want to use. So what we do is we do it from data. So we use labeled examples to learn some of these, parameters, hyperparameters, and, type of metric and so on. So let's look at this in terms of retrieval measures. So in our work, we took some corpus which had a number of Deshkar concerts and a number of Bhupali concerts. And we wanted to look at the influence of these parameters on some retrieval measures, such as cluster purity or receiver operating characteristic, which actually tells you about the true positive versus false positives. For the detection of pairs which are mismatched. For example, if I have two excerpts from two different ragas, and in particular the challenging case of allied ragas, then how well can I tell them apart by using a distribution that is computed with a specific set of hyperparameters and a distance measure. Okay, so we find some interesting things that you can actually increase the bin width for quite some bin interval for quite some intervals and still have perfect cluster purity. Okay, so up to a quarter tone. So 25 cents is one, not a tone really. Yes, it's a tone. So 100 cents is 1/12 of an octave. So this is a quite large interval. Human beings can easily tell this apart. And it turns out that, we can use bin width as high as this and still tell them, but should we be in making the distribution more coarse, then our cluster purity would take a sharp hit. Similarly, if we look at, the ROC kind of characteristics, we would find, tells us that yes, having a fine bin width is very good, but it's not so bad as you decrease the number of bins, that is the bin width gets coarser. This also tells us that of all the distances we consider, the Bhattacharya distance, which is motivated by the probability distributions that underlying the patterns we are looking at, turns out to give you the best performance. Okay, so we of course did this also on a much larger corpus involving other allied raga pairs, and we find that some of these results actually continue to hold, and therefore this data-based extraction of these parameters is good. We look at time scales now. For example, if we what is the amount of audio we need to come up with some of these accurate identification of the raga. The whole concert is great. But if you chop the concert up into smaller regions, we see performance going down. So it tells us that indeed the musician is conveying raga information over the course of the concert. Another interesting thing is that if you use only the initial part of the concert, you actually get very good raga information, which is also something that musicians know because they take a lot of pains in the beginning of the concert to reveal the raga. On the other hand, if you take a later portion of the raga, we find that the performance decreases because we see this curve actually moving down, which again gives us some insight into how much of the raga information is embedded in the different concert segments. If you look at changing across the concert, now this is like a plot which shows for every cycle of the concert, every rhythmic cycle, that the percussionist is playing. If you look at the distribution of notes, we see a certain pattern. This is where we also see improvisation. We have two concerts here by the same artist who, showing us different distributions. And this tells us that yes, indeed, artists are very careful about using raga characteristics, but they do have a lot of flexibility in terms of when they realize which notes or phrases, similarly for other ragas. Okay, and if we now look at a more detailed, description of the raga in terms of, or it's not more detailed, it's just more local. Okay, so we were looking at more cross representation in terms of a distribution derived from a large segment of the audio. But if I look at a single phrase, so for example, this is a particular phrase, gare sa, in the two ragas. It's a common motif in both ragas, but it turns out it has a different shape in Deshkar from the shape in Bhupali. And in fact, that tells us that when musicians realize these phrases, they are not simply uttering ga, re, sa, they are actually giving this motif or melodic shape. And the melodic shape itself is actually completely linked to the raga that they are singing. So this is yet another cue to raga distinction, looking at the melodic shapes of sequences which otherwise have actually the same, nominal labels in terms of the note sequences. Uh, so we could do some measurements on these and we would see that yes, indeed, there is, in the note durations, we find that the Deshkar Re has a very small distribution. Musicians are very careful about realizing Deshkar Re only as a lightly touched note or a note uttered in passing, whereas other notes tend to be higher, and there is overlap between many of the notes of Deshkar and Bhupali in terms of their temporal, support. But there is a strong distinction maintained in some components of the note shape. Similarly, in the intonation, it is known that Deshkar Ga note, for example, is intoned, several cents higher. They are both Ga than that in the Bhupali raga. So here is another distinction. So this suggests, some kind of features we could use for raga distinction. And it turns out that in the grammar also there are some indications. For example, we see that the re note is shown in parenthesis in Deshkar, indicating that it is a note that is to be uttered in passing, called an alpha note. And we also noticed the ga being mentioned in terms of, the grammar telling us about the differences in the intonation. And we saw that in the graph box plot earlier. Okay, so all this the acoustic variability that comes in the concert, that is, in the box plot, we saw that a lot of other notes tend to have overlapping characteristics. And that happens because although there is a distinction between the raga phrases in theory, in practice, there's a lot of variability within a particular raga phrase in the course of a concert, and also, of course, across concerts by different artists. And these come about because as the artist sings, there's a lot of context variation around that phrase, such as the tempo changing in the course of the concert, and all of these affects the shape. So identifying the shape and using the shape to discriminate, between ragas is not without its challenges. Because of all the other influences on the phrase shape due to the context in which it is sung. Okay, so that tells us that if we want to match up the phrases, we need to think of some more intelligent ways of doing it. This just shows 4 phrases with the same label from the same raga, but gives us an idea of the kind of variations in phrase shape that we could expect to see, across realizations of that phrase. So if we have to compare phrases, we need to do similarity computations at a different level. So for example, we have, we cannot just simply, quantize the melodic contour shown in blue into the discrete notes and do a matching, because chances are very high that the durations of the melodic contours are different. And how do you match 2 sequences of different duration, right? So we have to use something like, if you were doing matches between such sequences of pitches of, detected pitches, we would have to use something like dynamic time warping, which actually brings in some non-uniform scaling and, optimizes the alignment first, and then allows you, to compute the match on a more aligned set of sequences. Okay, so melodic similarity that I talked about has a number of applications. We can use the distributional and the structural representation to detect similarities in tune, key, raga, and so on. We could also use melodic contour to recognize different singing styles. It can be used in singing skill assessment to know the accuracy of somebody's singing. And of course, ragas are linked to moods and, at the high level can possibly use for that. Style variations, I'm not going to play this because of shortage of time, but you can just look at, let's say, a Hindustani rendition of a few notes and the Carnatic rendition of the same raga, actually. And you can see that there is much more ornamentation, or what we call gamak, in the Carnatic rendition. And presumably we can, compute or quantify that and should be able to tell these two styles apart, just like human beings can do so very easily and are probably listening for some of these cues. Okay, as I talked about, notation from compositions, we actually don't do that very much in Hindustani music, but we had some, interesting work on that, where we had a data set of bandishes, and bandish is a composition which embodies all the properties of a raga, and bandish notations are available, and we use that to see, what an analysis of that notation could tell us. So we obtained this from swarganga.org with the very kind permission of Mr. Advait Joshi. So we had this large number of bandishes across so many ragas, and a bandish notation looks like this. At the top, you see the rhythmic cycle intervals, and here we see the notes that occur in each of the intervals. So if we could just capitalize on, the note sequences, for example, does it tell us anything about the underlying raga? So we did this by trying to use the concept of embeddings because, the embedding of a note tells us something about the context in which it occurs. And, knowing that the order and the phrases of a raga are very characteristics of the raga, perhaps that actually does capture the identity of the raga. So we use this kind of BiLSTM network and, to learn an embedding and to use that embedding then as a representation and compute correlation between embeddings, to determine, let's say, how two ragas are different from each other. And some of the results indicated something like this. For example, we found ragas that fall in the same that, which essentially belong to the same parent scale, falling in clusters as opposed to ragas from a different scale. So this just shows us that there is potential also for MIR techniques. But of course, like I said, the difference between notation and the actual audio in the case of Indian music tends to be very, very high in Indian classical music, mainly because the performer also improvises, and we really do not have notation typically for those kind of scenarios. Okay, so it brings me to the very last application. I'm just trying to give you a glimpse of, what we can do with MIR techniques on this kind of concert audios. There's this really important application called structural segmentation. We know that music is structured, and the structure itself is determined by how the melody is changing, possibly the timbre, and also very much the rhythm in the case of Indian classical music. So structural segmentation refers to taking an audio waveform and using similarity to determine when the musical characteristics change in a big way. Okay, so now this happens to be a popular song which has been labeled as, okay, all of these segments are of some A type in terms of the musical characteristic, and then there's another A type but a little bit different, and then there is for maybe 20 seconds, the performer is in the B state, then C, which could refer to chorus perhaps over here in the C state, and so on. And it also tells us that the A state actually comes back later, right? So it's giving you a very, very nice graphic, view of the evolution of this song in time. This has multiple applications, browsing. For example, you want to jump from one section to another of a song, and also audio music summarization. We would like to condense a long concert of 1 hour into, let's say, a 5-minute kind of a trailer, which actually gives you all the highlights and of the concert, in which case we might not want to choose the first 5 minutes, but rather to choose, judiciously, little excerpts from all the different distinct sections of the song. Okay, so what does that mean for us in Indian classical music? If we look at a typical concert, metadata, it's not very much, but here is a concert by Kishori Amonkar. The CD cover tells us that she performed 2 ragas, and here is a zoomed in view of one of them. She performed the raga Deshkar. The bandish she sang was Piya Jag Jag. It was rendered in Madhyalay, which is telling us something about the tempo, and in Tintal, 16-beat cycle. And then she switched to another bandish in the same raga, of course, which is a Drut bandish, that is a faster tempo in the same tal. Okay, but actually, if you look at a Khayal concert, we have a lot of very rich structure. So for example, we have the alap, which does not have tabla. Then you have the part that is played with the tabla, which is, what we call the bandish section. And then, of course, from the musician starts with the alap, goes on to play the bada khayal and the chota khayal. And the bada khayal was the one at the medium tempo. Or slow tempo. The chota khayal is typically rendered at drut or the fast tempo. And then each of them has very distinct sections, such as sargam, tan, and so on. Okay. So is there something that we could use to section it into this and thus give us a very, very rich description of the concert? Okay, so a quick word on tempo. Tempo can be actually determined by finding onsets. For example, if you have a tabla playing, you can look at the tabla onsets, which appear in the spectrogram as vertical lines, and finding the distance between the onsets, or finding the underlying the beat would tell you something about the tempo, the BPM or the tempo. So essentially, we're finding the tempo and then, grouping sections together with similar tempo is what we would need to do in order to achieve the segmentation of our concert. So finding onsets, and, we have, MIR tools and signal processing tools that enable us to determine, the periodicity of onsets, which would eventually tell us the tempo. So if we looked at something called a rhythmogram, which looks like a spectrogram, but on the other hand is actually plotting more of timing information. So the lines over here are telling us about the pulsation rate. For example, the strong lines spaced far apart are telling us that the intervals between the main accents is large, and therefore the tempo is slow. It gets faster, and it gets much faster as we proceed along the concert. Okay, so this is a rather long concert. You can see over here, we have like 1200 seconds. So it's several minutes. And we already get a picture of the structure of this concert. Now, if we actually try to section it out in terms of these tempo variations, I can find 4 major sections immediately. So I'll just play clips of this. And you can look at the rhythmogram to see how informative it is about a certain nature of that segment, namely its rhythm and tempo. Okay, so this is the alap section, which actually does not have any clear pulsations. As we see, it's this very narrow portion here. And here we have got into the composition section, the bandish, which is at a regular tempo. Okay, and if I go to the last one, you can notice that the tempo is much higher, as we see from these very relatively closely spaced lines. And that was an analysis based mostly on the tabla. If we do an analysis based on the vocals, we also see certain distinctions that were not obvious there. For example, this is what we call the tan. It has a somewhat diffuse graphic here because there is no strong pulsation. as opposed to this, which has clear syllables and therefore a much more explicit division of the notes in time. Yeah, sorry for kind of beheading and making these clips out of this. Not the ideal way to listen to such great music. But this is what we wanted to see about how we actually can capture computationally the characteristics of these different sections, and thus come up with a rather informative description of the concert. That seems to be linked to that. Sorry about that. I just will go to the next. Okay, that brings me to my next slide here. Okay, so that I hope I achieved what I set out to try to do, to give you a glimpse of the kind of MIR work that's possible, and of course you only touch the surface. We know, of course, even Indian art music is an extremely vast and very, very diverse tradition. Also very sophisticated, and there is a lot that one could do, possibly with more kind of discussions and learnings from what musicology tells us, and what musicians know from their training. So understanding the acoustic and structural aspects actually helped us come up with the representation. The representation involved both time and frequency, and we linked it to the attributes, the high-level attributes of the music. Of course, we know human listeners still remain superior to machines, and that's what really drives research on modeling perception, as well as a priori knowledge about the music itself. And a lot of this work depends on data, and when large data sets are not available, that's where we must rely more and more on a priori knowledge. And the future in MIR is about moving to more deep learning methods, but also those which are perceptually informed. So that is what we would expect to see. Just to tell you something about some of the background to this work, that was actually supported by what is known as a CompMusic project. You can easily look it up. The project also had generated a number of collections and research data sets, and is altogether one of the more comprehensive organized places for MIR work on Indian music and some other non-Western genres such as Turkish music. There are other sources, such as this one from Durham, which has a number of excellent multi-track, concert recordings of Indian concerts. And multi-track really helps us to get to the individual instruments and the voice, and actually makes the task of MIR a little easier. And of course, can also be used to develop algorithms for tasks such as source separation. There are a number of software tools available these days. Librosa is a really powerful library, audio processing library for Python. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry if I overshot my time a bit, but of course, I'll be really glad to answer any question now or later. Yeah, thank you.
Well, we aren't sorry at all. We are glad that you ran over time. This is, I truly feel very blessed to have listened to your talk. It is amazing. There are a bunch of questions here as well, and I'll just ask the folks to ask it themselves. Gurmukh, would you like to ask your question by unmuting your mic?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. Ma'am, my question is that in one of your slides, you said that the distance between notes gets smaller as we go on to higher octaves. So there was something about the 12th root of 2. So my question is that why is it so that the distance between notes reduces as we go on to higher octaves, and what would happen if the distance between two notes stay exactly the same across all the octaves?
Okay. Yeah. So that's a good question. Actually, when I talked about the distance between notes, I was referring to the distance in absolute frequency. Okay. So there is another distance, and that's a logarithmic distance, which stays the same. Okay. So what really, there is obviously something that stays the same between, let us say, two notes separate, like on the keyboard, which are two adjacent notes on the keyboard. And what stays the same is the ratio. Okay. So it's a log frequency. So that is the nature of the musical scale. And that is also linked to human perception, where we can discriminate two frequency tones much more easily at low frequencies compared to high frequencies, if they are the same number of hertz apart. Okay, so our hearing also, essentially follows a logarithmic frequency scale. So they are actually the same, except that we should say same in terms of what, and for that we need to say in terms of the ratio or the log of the frequency. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Rao. And Gurmukh actually is a wonderful Dilruba player, by the way.
Wow.
So
Okay.
so he's been learning for a number of years.
Oh,
From
that's
Noor, would you
beautiful.
like to ask your question?
Yes. So actually, I wanted to ask if there is some work done in training of students while practicing some raga. Like just we saw before, there was Raga Layya Bilawal, and both knees, Shodhni and Komalni, come there. So are there some models which could help me, like when I'm practicing and there was some recurring pattern of dhani dhapa and their komalni has to come, but generally for new learners they would take the shodhni itself. So is there some work done in that?
Yeah, Noor, that's an excellent question. And clearly, you're a very good musician because, this actually, what you mentioned became evident, at least to me, only when we did, all this analysis. So, yes, indeed, that, so we can capture, the phrases or look at the distribution across, a few minutes of playing that raga and examine it to see whether the expected patterns are there or not. Okay, so we saw both knees popping up. We might, be able to give feedback, to the musician or to the, to the student that something is not quite right. Okay, so that visual representation actually does show the distribution, and it directly relates to the presence of that note in terms of the strength with which it appears in the distribution.
Okay, and can we get from that visual, like we saw the pitch distribution and all, can we generate some notations from the audio of a bandish or something like that?
Yes. So essentially, that pitch distribution tells you where the notes, where the major notes lie. So you can see it looks quite discrete. Although the pitch seems to be varying, eventually good musicians tend to use those locations. Right. So we could use that and again go back to the full melodic line and label it based on the relatively steady regions that coincide with those raga notes. Okay. So yes, it can be used, but like I pointed out, there are also a lot of transition regions, right? So for example, one of those knees in the dhani dapa, it's just barely touched, and to recognize that there is a note knee there would involve a little more, knowledge, so that we can, tailor our detection rules to actually find it, which would eventually be based on understanding the raga itself, knowing the raga.
Thank you.
Vijay, I guess, is asking how AI can be used to improve the pitch. I presume it's kind of been covered in the last answer, or would you like to add anything more there?
Okay, so I think those were some of the early applications which did not really require AI. There was something, like I think we've heard that the music industry used a lot of auto-tune, right? So that was pretty much, an application of knowing the grid, scale notes. And of course, that it was also important because possibly there was an orchestra playing and, everything has to be perfectly in tune. So yes, indeed, those are some of the applications that are already out there, okay, commercially. And they happen to be products of MIR kind of work. Yeah.
In terms of analysis, looking at whether somebody is a stalwart versus somebody who's early in their career, has there been some work to distinguish between two people singing the same rag but with less ability or greater prowess? Has there been some work there also?
Yeah, actually, that's an extremely attractive, kind of a problem to try. And yes, but of course, again, it depends on having labeled data and so on. But we may not be able to discriminate at the higher levels, but at somebody at a foundation level, for example, we should be able to use something as simple as distributions or melodic shapes to actually see whether they are conforming to the raga grammar or not. But the raga itself, in its full manifestation, has so many, has such a wide scope and needs to be described in so many different ways that it's really hard to tell, and that's what they say. A musician, in fact, recreates, the word create is very important. So they're playing something they probably never played before. So it's not about, finding out everything and, coming up with a template for it. But still a discerning listener knows that, although they are going to new territory, they're still within the bounds of the raga. So it's extremely fascinating to try and understand that. And yes, indeed, those are clearly matters for research. But of course, like I said, would involve collaboration, with the musicologists and musicians. Yeah.
I guess, I mean, with Khayal music, they say it's like creating a painting, right, within the
Absolutely.
basics.
Correct. And so there are many ways to be right. And in fact, creativity is encouraged because, you can't be repeating exactly the same thing. You would not be considered a very great musician. So, what's the fine line between, being inaccurate and being extremely creative?
Right. And I hear even the maestros, like there's a famous quote of Bade Ghulam Ali Khan Sahab, who said that even when he went onto stage, every time he'd hold his ear and say, "Suro se dar lagta hai, kyunki pata nahi kab daga de den," kind of thing, right? So there's a lot of
Correct.
interesting.
Those are...
And just a very personal question: was the last recording that you were playing? I mean, was that Ustad Amir Khan Sahab, or did I pick it up wrong?
No, that was a Rashid Khan
Okay.
song. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. There are questions here. Quite a few questions by Ravinder. Ravinder, do you want to unmute and ask your questions?
Sure, Sabudh sir. So I'll start with the smallest one first. And it's a very specific question on the deep learning for music thing. So essentially, one of the question is that what window size or hop size which you think works best heuristically for, let's say, Mel spectrogram like feature for general music information retrieval?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really wasn't able to go into those details, but we'll be glad to, go over it later. But, there's something about, obviously, like you said, it is related to the music, and we want to choose analysis intervals which essentially are long enough to capture the characteristics or properties that you're looking for, but still short enough to include only one audio event at a time, right? Like I showed you, you can't take a very long window and get all the average characteristics because that doesn't give us the sequential information we need. So in music, typically, window lengths would be something like 40, 50 milliseconds, maybe even up to 100 milliseconds, but not much more than that.
Okay.
But once again, you might actually benefit from changing it for your particular kind of music.
Got it. And the second quick one is what are your particular views, if any, on the generative models like GANs in MIR, specifically like what is their potential for understanding the representation of music in human brains? I mean, is it a good models to explore and understanding the representation, how music is interpreted? Do we reproduce music in our brain when we listen to it? And can we model GANs in order to understand that?
Okay, so what I think is that our understanding of the brain is actually going to help us do, deep learning better, probably. And where there have been generative models actually, generating new sounds, for example, they've been quite successful. For example, morphing instruments, one into the other. But music itself has so much high level structure. And so far, I think, AI techniques have found it hard to grapple with that structure, which lies at multiple time scales. So that is one of the challenges, about, just like we said about musicians, about being creative and repetitive just to the right extent. You know, if you're completely creative, you know, you're doing a new thing every time, it might be so chaotic that people just can't latch on. On the other hand, being very repetitive is not very good either, right? And all of this happens at multiple time scales, very large time scales also. So those are some of the challenges. Also, although you know, of course, that music generation is being, you know, attempted quite a lot. And yes, indeed, it will, you know, the fields will feed each other. So we will, like you say, understand better about brain functioning. On the other hand, you know, there may be something, the neuroscience that actually helps us constrain algorithms in particular ways.
Okay. So, Dr. Sabudh, I do have a couple questions, but I'll give it the space to somebody else in case they want to ask first, and then I can maybe reach out those two other questions.
Sure, Vinder. Shreyas, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
Yeah, so my question was regarding the graph which you showed towards the beginning of the session, like the difference between a normal human speech and a musical note. Like there were discrete frequencies involved, like 200, 400, 600, 800, that. So my question is, how is it that being an arithmetic progression still still all multiples of 200 make up the musical note? Like there must only be frequencies which are multiples of each other, right? Like 200, 400, 800 and so on.
Okay, so that set of harmonic components are all related. So if you call F0 as the first component, then 2F0, 3F0 and all other components, okay? Not to be confused with allowed pitches. Allowed pitches are in ratios, but these are the individual frequency component of a given sound, of a given pitch. Okay, they are called the overtones.
Like if the first sa, if I consider the sa at 200, then
Correct.
the upper sa will be at 400, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So the next upper sa will be at 800.
800, correct,
So
absolutely.
what will the 600 be in that case?
Right, I don't know, but that figure was about the actual spectrum. So the spectrum contains all the harmonics, but what you are talking about is the fundamental frequency. So in the musical scale, my sa will be 200, next sa 400, next sa 800. 600 is going to be some other note between the two sas.
Okay, but that will still be in the harmonics, right?
No, it will not be. Yes, it happens to be in the harmonic of the sa, but then we're doing two completely different descriptions here.
Okay.
One is of the allowed pitches, which is in the logarithmic kind of progression, and the other was the actual frequency components in a given sound, which is like just a Fourier series representation.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yeah, you're most welcome. Yeah.
Ravinder, back to you if you want to ask your questions quickly.
For sure. So thank you. The other question I had, again, it's all related to the deep learning side of the music MIR task. You showed an example where we used a transformer or bi-LSTM and kind of note embeddings. Are there any where we can actually leverage the power of neural networks, where we say that we feed let's say we feed a raw audio signal and let the network figure out its own feature? Because trying to hand engineer features is a very painful task, as music is pretty imprecise in that. So have you seen this happening a lot recently, or attempts on how do we leverage the deep neural network to figure it out, the feature itself, rather than doing the hard work of doing it? Have you seen that in your experience?
Actually, using that time frequency representation itself is an extremely, at least to, the people working in the field, it's already a very basic representation. Right? Mm-hmm. It's used for speech, it's used for music, it's used for all kinds of sounds. There are projects on environmental sound, distinction finding, which again involve those same two-dimensional time frequency representations. So we are actually using something fairly basic. So we do not necessarily explicitly extract, the melody and the rhythm and so on these days. They do use, but of course, the deep learning techniques, and they require a lot of label data. Mm-hmm. In order to do that, which is also giving rise to other interesting topics, such as how do you augment your data, or how do you do some sort of transfer learning and so on. But yes, you are right that there is a shift, but the representations that I use now are, going back more to those MEL spectrogram and the spectrogram and so on. And in some cases, the waveform itself. But again, every lower level you go, you have more,
computations.
you have computations, and you have a more sophisticated network, and therefore you need more data to train.
Okay. So specifically to MEL spectrogram, essentially the technique which is used is, if I choose MEL spectrogram as a feature set, then I will be probably doing the computer vision techniques on the MEL spectrogram, and then I'm actually doing a very rude approximation of what music. I mean, it's kind of an insult to a music representation sometimes to think of a computer vision technique. So what in your mind for a general music retrieval task is a good robust feature set, and is it like, can I concatenate two different features and feed it to the neural network, or MEL spectrogram using computer vision technique is still a very good way to sort of go about doing it?
Yeah, actually, it's hard to say. And again, it depends on your data and task. But clearly, in principle, you could take something as crude as MEL spectrogram, have a sophisticated enough network, and good, target data, a good loss function, and, actually do the job. Right. So it's true that a lot of people like us who have been working in the area for a while are not terribly happy, about this brute force application of, let's say, computer vision techniques. But it does work, if you have the right data and the right amounts of it.
Do I lose melody and other kind of information when I'm using MEL spectrogram? Am I compromising on the subtle feature set if I use MEL spectrogram?
Actually, there's not that much information lost, because in fact, in a lot of these techniques, the spectrogram itself is, the output of the algorithm, and then it is inverted to get back the time domain signal. So most of the music properties are still there. They are not explicit, but they are there. And, like I said, if you have enough label data and your target, your task happens to be about getting the melody, and you have enough label data in terms of, let's say, a sequence of pitches or labeling kind of annotation, then yes, there are methods that actually manage to, solve that problem using deep learning.
Thank you. And this was fantastic session. Very
I'll be
invigorating.
To talk
Thank
to
you.
anytime.
Thank you.
Thanks for your questions, Ravinder. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Professor Rao. We've kept you longer than we had promised.
Oh, no, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I just hope I managed to convey the excitement of the field. Yeah.
Absolutely. Because like I said, I definitely felt blessed, and I was getting a number of messages from folks who are listening to you that, this is one of the most exceptional sessions we've had in this webinar series. So thank you so much for opening up the minds of the young folk that are here,
sure.
and the not so young as well. And we look forward to engaging with you in the longer term and getting more insights into this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be more than happy to do that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're most welcome. Yeah. Thank you very much again for having me here.
Not at all. The pleasure was all ours. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.